And each beatitude, the Sermon on the Mount starts with the Beatitudes. And each beatitude could be a sermon in itself. But what I want to happen today is I want you to start thinking of the Beatitudes maybe a little bit differently. I want you to think of a ladder. And on the ladder they have rungs, right? And we're going to start at the very bottom rung as we go with the Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes build upon each other. These are our instructions and the way we should live. People sometimes ask me, well, as a Christian, how do you live? What do you say? What do you think? Jesus is teaching the disciples these things. So we're going to put it into perspective here. You know, it's called the Sermon on the Mount because Jesus gave it on the hillside near Capernaum. And I believe the sermon probably took several days. And we'll see over the next several weeks how the sermon will challenge the proud and legalistic leaders of the day, the religious leaders. It will call them back to the messages of the Old Testament prophets who, like Jesus, taught that heartfelt obedience is more important than legalistic observance. Now, we might think that the Old Testament is all about the sacrifices of the animals. And that was the law of Moses that God gave him. But really, what it boils down to is that God wanted heartfelt obedience to him. And the Old Testament prophets taught that. I think it is important for us to understand that the Sermon on the Mount does not deal with salvation as such. But it lays out for the disciple, for the believer in Jesus, and the potential disciples, how regarding Jesus as King translates into ethics and daily living. Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7 is what is commonly called Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And in this discourse, Jesus gives us a glimpse of what he called the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven. Today, I'm thinking about the word kingdom. And it is somewhat culturally distanced from the experience of most 21st century Americans. They just don't think that way. So I'm going to be using the word or the phrase God's world instead of God's kingdom as the message continues this morning. Jesus said that God's world was both future and present. That is, in the future, God will install a new structure, a new government. And this, he says, is what it's going to look like. This is the teachings. This is what it's going to look like. But Jesus also says that God's world has already, in another sense, entered into the present age. In Matthew 5's readings, we are given an Instagram shot of the people of God's world and the ethics of God's world. And it's going to break down like this over the next several weeks. Today, we're going to look at the people of God's world, the first part, verses 1 through 12 of chapter 5. Next week, we'll look at the second part of the people of God's world, verses 13 through 20. May 2nd, we're going to look at the ethics of God's world, verses 21 through 37. And on May the 9th, we'll finish up chapter 5, verses 38 through 48. And now, this is going to be a very quick glimpse of it all. You know, the United States is an ethnically and religiously diverse nation, right? We are that way. And this is true of many nations throughout the world. But what nations of the world are most standardized? And I believe that's going to be our starting point for a discussion of another nation as we look at it this morning. God's nation. God's world. So what do the people of God's world look like? How do they live? What do they believe? What can be expected of them? Now, it's no secret that Americans' culture is one of the most diverse tapestries of humanity of any country in the world. We value diversity, multiculturalism, because our country consists of people who are literally from every tribe and nation of this world. In many areas, you are likely to hear someone speaking another language in the grocery store, as you would hear the local American. But not every country is diverse. So I'd like to ask you a question this morning. What do you suppose is the most ethnically standardized country in the world? Some of you might say Japan. Some of you might say China. Maybe the Koreas, for example. Maybe, I don't know, African nation. Maybe an Arab country, or maybe a Far Eastern Europe country. I think Japan would be a good answer, because it has these tight immigration rules and significant learning curve for the language. Other nations